Welcome. We are here to watch and learn from Elizabeth and Monty as they present the results of something they've been working on for a full academic year at this point. It has been an epic journey. We're incredibly proud of both of them. Doing a senior research project is no small feat, and you've had to do a lot. You've had to struggle. You've had to overcome a lot of unknowns based on a lot of things that you've never done before, including what do you do when your faculty supervisor leaves your posters on the train at the conference where you're supposed to present them. But we've overcome every obstacle. I'm incredibly proud of you both, and it will be a real treat to hear from both of you tonight. First up, we will have Liz Bowyer and then Monty Thomas. A few words about Liz. I've known Liz since she first came in. I did not have the pleasure to be her academic advisor, but I've had her in many classes, and she's been a fantastic tutor and office worker, administrator, creator of art, and all of the things that we need done at the last minute. Liz is an incredibly hard worker. It's been an absolute joy and pleasure to have you as a student. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you to talk to us about water.
Yeah. Water.
Good.
Okay. All right. Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth, and today I get to present my senior seminar research to you all. I'm really excited. What I did on my study on was the impact of utility stress and knowledge on people's willingness to conserve water. So before I get into my research questions and my study as a whole, I just want to tell you a little bit about why I decided to do this topic. I have worked at my hometown's wastewater treatment plant it will be 4 years this summer. And so this is something I never thought I'd be interested in, but it's been something that I've really grown to enjoy learning about. And what I hear at work, I hear a lot about like the issues that our plant faces and the things that we have to deal with, as well as plants all over the country and the things they have to deal with, and how sometimes it's really hard to find solutions to those problems simply because they either don't exist or they take a lot of money and time to achieve. And also just this idea that like a lot of people don't know about this stuff. And so I wanted to do a study that would bring attention to these kind of topics that people don't know a lot about. So my research questions for my study are, does people's willingness on climate change impact their willingness to conserve water? And does utility stress impact consumers' willingness to conserve water? And when I refer to utilities, I'm talking about water, like utility plants, like wastewater, the people that clean our water and make sure that it's safe for us to drink. And then the people who take in like wastewater and stormwater and make sure it's safe to put back into the environment later on. So a little bit about why we should care about this and why it's important to talk about. So clean water is something that we all want and that we all need to live, quite honestly. So it's something that we rely on our government to provide for us. Like our EPA, like municipality governing actors, things like that, the people that make sure it's clean and meets standards. And there are a lot of issues that our treatment facilities like experience and like have, kind of like I mentioned earlier. And something that I think a lot of people don't know about is that we lose so much treated water every single day in this country simply because our infrastructure is not capable of doing what it needs to do anymore because it's really old. And when I say infrastructure, I mean like the pipes that get the water from the treatment facility to our homes and the treatment facilities themselves. It's like the actual places that do what needs to be done. That's what I mean when I say infrastructure, because I'm going to talk about it a lot. So it's something that really needs to be fixed and something that we're going to look at as we progress through the study. Something that I wanted to focus on when doing this study and why I kind of focus my research questions around conservation is because it's just one thing that everyday people just like us, it's something that we can do to help. And while it may not seem like it makes a huge difference, it really, really does. Water conservation can decrease the cost of treating water. It can save money, time, and energy on all fronts of the treatment process. And also just educating our youth on conservation is something else we can do. Because if we teach people from a very young age that these are the things they can do to help, then they're going to be more likely to do them as they grow up, rather than like trying to force them to learn it later on in life. And while I think everyone can benefit from the results of this study simply because we are all consumers of water and it does impact us in several different ways, I think educators, legislators, and the water and wastewater operators are people that will benefit the most, simply because those are the people that can make the most change on like big levels. Those are the people that can get the new infrastructure. Those are the people that can educate the people of our country, and the people that deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So this is my conceptual framework for my study. This just lays out the variables that I looked at and how they're going to influence one another. And so my dependent variable is willingness to conserve. I'm going to get into this and the specifics of it in just a minute, but my willingness to conserve variable was created by, well, I guess by me. I used 5 questions from my survey and created a willingness to conserve index score for each of my respondents based off of answers to, like I said, 5 questions from my study that had to do with water conservation behaviors, views on climate change, views on government spending, things like that. My utility confidence and knowledge, those are my 2 independent variables. When I say utility confidence, I just mean like, do people trust their water provider to give them clean, safe water to drink? Like, how much confidence do they put in them to do their job correctly? And then my other one is knowledge, and by that I'm just referring to prior knowledge that people have had on the topic and whether or not that impacts their willingness to conserve water. So before I can talk about the results of my study, I feel that it's extremely important to understand like background on everything I'm talking about, as well as kind of where we started and where we have come over the years. So when our nation started to industrialize, we faced a lot of problems that we obviously hadn't before, including in our drinking water and just water in general. Toxins, oils, chemicals, things like that started to enter our water stream whenever big corporations would come in or businesses would be built, things like that. And so the government decided to step in and create regulations and acts that kind of protect those water sources and kind of set the standards for what they need to be safe for people. So the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was created in 1948, and in 1972, it was later amended to be what we know today as the Clean Water Act. And this act is what regulates pollution and like what constitutes something as pollution, as well as sets the standards for wastewater and surface water. And then in 1974, we created the Safe Drinking Water Act, which sets the regulations for our drinking water, including the water treatment plants that, again, have to meet these standards set by the government for what's safe to drink. Like I mentioned before, our country has known what it's like to live in a place that doesn't have water regulation. And I have Love Canal up here as a perfect example of that. In the 1970s, there was a man who wanted to build a neighborhood and wanted like a canal running through it because, you know, it's super pretty and aesthetic, but ended up not working out. And so a company bought the land and they used it as a dumping ground for waste and other toxins and things from their business. And then they decided when they sold it, they were just going to cover it with dirt and act like nothing ever happened, which this obviously caused a lot of problems when people did start to build houses on it, because those chemicals and toxins and things were in the groundwater, and then that resulted in like really harmful health problems and issues for all the people that consumed the water from that area. So obviously these regulations and these acts and these things put in place by our government are super important and crucial to like our safety and other facets of our everyday lives. So when I did research on people's willingness to conserve water, a lot of what I found was what motivates them or dissuades them from conserving water. And whenever I looked into this, it shows that a lot of people who take more social and environmental concerns into account when deciding how much water they're going to use and what they're going to do to conserve water, those people use less water than those who use like cost and convenience as the motivating or dissuading factor. So when I say cost and convenience, I mean like the people that are like, oh, it's cheap, it's readily available, like I don't really care how this impacts anyone else, like this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to use this water. Those are people who use more. And then they also talked about peer influence and how that plays a really big role in what motivates or dissuades us from doing things, which I think that can be seen in a lot of different areas of life, but also in water conservation attitudes. People who are surrounded by other people who have negative attitudes towards conserving water are also more likely to have a negative attitude because it's this idea of like, oh, they don't care, so why should I? Which obviously, that's not what we want to hear, but that's the reality of this study. And one of the reasons I was really excited to look at how willingness to conserve water was impacted by like utility, like stress and like trust in a utility to do a job was because I couldn't find a lot on it. And so I was excited to see kind of what the results look like from that angle as well. So then with public knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, one of the motivations for doing this study was because I don't think a lot of people know about it. Because I didn't know a lot about it until I started working for this kind of area of our lives. So I wanted to do it because, well, I think people need to be educated on it. But one of the big things that I found when I was researching this was a lot on education programs and how if we implement better education programs in areas such as water and wastewater, then people will be a lot more likely to like implement those conservation habits and like the knowledge that they learned at a young age later on in life. So one thing that I found was a study on wildfire education. And I think that's somewhat comparable to water and wastewater simply because it's like not a super mainstream topic that's taught, but it's more like environmentally related and something that's probably only taught in areas where like wildfires happen. But what they found was that students engage more whenever they are exposed to like learning or diverse learning environments. So going on field trips, having guest speakers come in and talk to them, and especially like relating what they learn to their own community and experiences, like the things that actually impact them. Also, what they found was that teachers need resources that they can be confident in teaching and things that like they understand. So I think one thing we could really do to improve this area is to like simply just help our teachers have the resources they need to teach topics like this because there's not a lot available on it. One thing I didn't know a lot about until I started doing research on it was citizen science. And I think it's super interesting because we're surrounded by it every day and we just don't know it. The goal of citizen science is to expose people who aren't in scientific career fields and just like everyday people to science projects and science ideas and just new topics that they maybe would have looked at before. So I have green infrastructure up here as an example because green infrastructure is something that a lot of cities are trying to do better with because most cities are just like concrete jungles is what you hear, and they don't really have a lot of green or trees or plants or anything. So it's about putting the green back into those areas and being more environmentally friendly and allowing like a lot of stormwater and rainwater to go instead of just rushing down the streets and causing flooding. They go back into these areas, like rain gardens, for example, are one, and the water goes into those areas and then into the gardens and just rushing down the street. So it's safer and it helps a lot of the problems that wastewater treatment facilities face because they can't handle that really large like uptake of water. So cities like St. Louis, for example, have publicly funded grant opportunities for people in certain areas to get money from the city to implement like rain gardens on their own property. And I think this is just one way that can help kind of spread knowledge on the topic and increase knowledge on the topic, because if people are actually doing it and seeing that like, oh, what I did makes a change, I think that helps increase knowledge in the area just like in general. So I think having more opportunities for the public is something that we can really do to help. So stress on utilities and utility trust. First and foremost, I'm going to introduce this photo over here. This is a water treatment plant. Wastewater treatment plants also look very similar. So when I'm talking about infrastructure, this is like the treatment facility part that I'm talking about. Just so you guys can have a picture and see, because I think most people probably don't know what they look like. But so most of the treatment facilities in our country and also just kind of around the world face a lot of stress. And when I say stress, I mean like problems that they face and issues that they experience. So for example, with climate change, the increase in storms and the like seriousness of the storms creates problems because, like I kind of mentioned earlier, our wastewater treatment plants weren't built to withstand that amount of water, and they oftentimes flood, and it prevents them from doing their job properly, which is obviously something very important that needs to happen. So these problems can arise as a result of like economic and political issues, like I just mentioned, climate change, like ecological, but also infrastructural. And like I mentioned, these are so old. Some of our infrastructure in our country are like as old as the 1800s. And so the fact that some of them even still work is shocking, but most of them don't work, and that's the problem. And this stress can be shown to consumers in several different ways. discoloration of water, the way the water tastes, if it has a weird smell, low pressure, or just like not having water at all if you know you're supposed to. Those are all indicators that boil waters, for example, are a really great example of like, oh no, my utility is under stress. They're facing problems that they can't fix right now. This idea that clean water is everywhere, that's like not true. There are places in the United States that do not have access to clean water. Flint, Michigan being a super great example. A lot of different kind of issues played into the tragedy of Flint, Michigan's water supply. And I think that just shows like, even though we're in America, which is like this super advanced country, like we still face these problems too. And then I looked at trust in utility providers, and I found that most people, or the studies show that most people trust their utility provider, but the ones who trust them the most are the people that have been in contact with their provider, have regular open communication with who gives them their water and who supplies it to them, and that increased trust. So I think it's really interesting to see how we could build like that consumer utility relationship and how we could increase communication in that area. So to gather my data, I did a 20-question survey. Survey had questions relating to water conservation, experiences with your water, like opinions on water just in general. And most of my respondents were college-age students, which kind of makes sense when I look at how I distributed my survey. And it does kind of present a little bit of a limitation later on when looking at my data like in a more analysis kind of way, but it still allowed me to gather really, I think, valuable results and information, but it does represent a very small, limited population. It does not represent like the world as a whole, obviously. What you're looking at right here is a graph on my willingness to conserve score, index score, and like the distribution of scores among my respondents. So like I mentioned earlier, I told you I was going to explain this. So what I did was I took 5 questions, and for each of those questions, I took the response that represented the most willingness to conserve behavior, and I gave it a score of 1. And then I took the response to each of those questions that represented the least willing to conserve behavior, and I gave it, if there were 3 options, it was a 3. If there were 5 options, it was a 5. And I added those numbers together, and each of my respondents got a score. So the willingness to conserve index scores are on the bottom. My lowest was a 5, and my highest was a 3. The lower the number, the more willing that person is to conserve. The higher the number, the less willing that person is to conserve. And as you can see, most of my respondents had scored anywhere from like 8 or less. So kind of, I don't know, kind of interesting to see how most people are like pretty willing to conserve. And there's only a few that are like super, super willing or like not as willing. So then looking at my analysis, I did ANOVA tests, and what you're looking at here is a box plot for those ANOVA tests that I ran. And what I did for this first one was I compared the willingness to conserve index scores with a question on my survey that was, in the past year, have you personally been notified that you're under a boil order? And the options that my respondents had were more than twice, once, or no. And what I hypothesized was that respondents who had experienced 2 or more boil orders in the past year were going to have lower willingness to conserve scores, indicating that they are the more willing to conserve respondents in the study. And what I found was that, like, yes, these respondents that had experienced 2 or more were slightly more willing to conserve based off of their scores. And the reason I chose boil order, like the boil order question, was because I think boil order serves as a proxy for utility stress. Because like I kind of said, if your utility, like if you're going under a boil order, that's a pretty good indicator that something's going on at your treatment plant, and is an issue that the plant is trying to deal with. So kind of a main takeaway from this is that utility stress does have an impact on people's willingness to conserve water. So kind of the same deal here with this question. For this one, I looked at the willingness to conserve index scores in comparison with people's opinions on climate change. So the question was, how much, if at all, do you think climate change is currently affecting severe weather events or temperature patterns in the United States? And I hypothesized that people who felt that climate change was impacting our weather a great deal were going to have lower scores, indicating they're more willing to conserve. And as you can see, this one is a little bit of a more linear trend here. Oh, I forgot to mention that each of these little dots here, that's one response. So in this graph more specifically, or in this box plot, the dots are more kind of clustered together, showing that more people kind of had like similar responses in these areas. But what this kind of shows is that views on climate change also impact willingness to conserve water, and is something that I think is definitely interesting to look at in regards to the way people feel and how they are going to act on those feelings about it. So kind of just reiterating what I said, people who feel that climate change is affecting our weather patterns are going to be more likely to conserve water when compared to those who don't feel that it's impacting us as much. And the same goes for Bowyer water. People who have experienced those more often than people who have not are slightly more willing to help conserve water. And I think that a reason for this could be because they're feeling it firsthand. So they understand that their utility is under stress and they're feeling problems. So they want to do what they can to help. So what does this all mean? My study highlighted these two areas that I think have a lot of room for growth. And I think that if we focused on them, we could change a lot of things in other areas as well. So utility, confidence, and individual conservation behavior, I think are those two areas that if we really focus in and work on growing them, then we can make improvements in other areas, those areas being infrastructure and education. It's really, we need the help of our legislators and policymakers in order to get that infrastructure changed. So I think that if we increase education as well, then knowledge increases. And if knowledge increases, then that willingness to do something and get other people to help us do things will also increase. And we can't change the infrastructure without the help of federal actors, because we need money and we need manpower and time. And one other thing that my study did that I think was really interesting was looked at this idea of things that impact us as individuals versus things that impact us as a global like just world as a unit. When looking at Boyle order in comparison to willingness to conserve, it kind of focusing on this idea of like, this is impacting me more directly. So the scores that I got from my or the scores that were accumulated for my respondents and the way they differ from that of their response to the question about climate change, I think it's really interesting to see kind of the change and the difference between those. And I think that there could be a lot more room for growth and like more research on that topic. And I think that's somewhere that maybe this kind of study could go in the future. And I think that that's really important to look at and understand. So thank you all for listening. I really appreciate all of you coming, and I will now be taking questions. Yeah.
I'm not sure this came up in your research, but my grandmother was ahead of her time. She always said, you don't waste water and you don't waste food. And likewise, when I was in school many years ago, we had Smokey the Bear. We saw Smokey the Bear.
Yeah.
I think we had Fire Prevention Week.
Yeah.
And we studied that. So I'm just curious, in your research, did you find any examples of education reaching younger people, younger children,
Like,
to bring an awareness of just how important that conservation is?
so I couldn't find a whole lot that was done on like treatment plants and utilities themselves. I mean, from my response, because I also asked a question in my survey about did you receive any sort of like conservation education in school or education on utilities at all? And most of some of my respondents had said like, oh yes, like, you know, we went on a field trip to the treatment plant, or, you know, we were taught about like shut your faucet off when you're brushing your teeth or take fast showers and stuff like that. But for the most part, like a lot of the respondents were like, no, like we didn't do anything regarding that in school. And I really struggled to find research showing that anything like that was done in any significant form. And that's kind of why I took the route of looking at like wildfire education, because I could find a lot more on that. And I feel like it's a very comparable sort of idea. So no, to answer your question, like I didn't find a whole lot on it. And the people that did take my survey also didn't experience much growing up or anything like that either. So yeah.
I have two questions actually. So early on, first or second slide, you said that we lose 6 billion gallons from the infrastructure because of infrastructure issues. Like how? Is it leaks or what is going on?
So yes, sometimes. Yeah, most of the time it is. Yes, it like just leaks through the pipes, or well, for example, actually, so Carlinville's getting new water meters, right? So they're getting water meter, they need new water meters because the ones they have right now are so old and they're not reading water consumption properly. Which probably means that when people do get new water meters, they're probably gonna be kind of upset at their first bill because it's probably gonna be reading it right for the first time in a very long time.
I think they overestimate, so I think people, if they read it right, I think people will be happy.
Okay, well, I hope that is the case because I don't want, that would be hard to deal with. But they're getting new water meters because they're so old and because they don't read it properly, but also like that results in a water loss, which is also money loss and time loss, if you think about it like that. So I mean, yes, most of the time, yes, it is simply leaking out of the pipes, or it's just like not getting where it's supposed to be going. So definitely need new of that because that's not good.
So my second question is a little more convoluted.
Okay.
And it's just purely an opinion question, just
Okay.
because you know more about this than I do.
Okay.
Well, than anybody in the room does. Okay, so you know, when talking about public policy, I'm a huge fan, right, of the issue attention cycle, right? I see people in my class going, not this again, Shelley. But I love it, it's so simple, right? So, right, so it was just real quick, for those of you who don't know, right? So, there's something's a problem, but we don't care about it. So it's a pre-problem. And then something happens and there's alarm discovery and it's on everybody's radar. But then we start to realize, oh, this is gonna cost some money to fix this. And so we're like, it's not that big of a problem. And then we go right back to pre-problem. So there's a little tiny window there where you can actually do something, where people are still caring. Right, so obviously with water, things like Flint, Michigan, East Palestine train derailment are alarm discovery things. But do you think that we're at a stage now where like everything should be alarm discovery? Like, do you think like our water system is so bad? And also, I mean, it's not, it's a finite resource, right? So we're gonna run out of it. Do you think we need to start making people realize that like it's all alarm discovery when it comes to the problem of clean water? I'm just wondering what your opinion is.
I do think so. I mean, you're right, like at some point something has got to give, and I think that things have been giving for so long that now at this point, like I do think everything should be alarming, and the fact that it is water and it is something that we quite literally need to survive, and like not even just like drinking water, but like we shower in it, we use it for agriculture, we use it for like literally so many things. And I think that everything that is normally categorized as alarming, like I think that everything should fall into that simply because it is so vital that we have it. And I don't know, I definitely just think that people need to care more. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay.
So in a few years, when you are a water treatment operator and you are sitting around and you're like, oh, I have all this time and all this money, what should I do? What would be your citizen science program?
I definitely think something that, I think about this all the time when I'm at work in the summer and I'm like walking around the plant. I'm like, this is so cool. And I never even knew it existed. And like, I found out that my first grade teacher, her husband was the guy who was in charge of Shelbyville's wastewater treatment plant for like years. And I'm like, why did we never come visit this place? Why did we never learn about it? Because I didn't realize how important like the processes of water treatment and wastewater treatment plants were until I started working for one. And so I think something that I would do, I guess I don't know if it counts as much as citizen science as it does like education, but I definitely think I would work on implementing like, I guess actually the whole public could come actually. I think that would be really cool. So not just you, but I think I would try to make a system where people from the outside could come in and we could provide like tours, informational, like I don't want to call them meetings, but like classes, I guess, something like that kind of involves the community more rather than just like the people that show up to city hall meetings and want to complain about things. Like I think it would be better if we could allow them to come and see what we actually do on a daily basis. Because things such, I mean, gathering samples around the plant doesn't take, it takes like 15 minutes. So like, if people could come in and come around with us and watch us do that, and like we explain as we go, much like my coworkers do in the summer when I go with them, they explain as we go and they make me understand like what we're doing and why we're doing it and like why it's so important. And so I think being able to do that for the public would be something that'd be really, really cool and would allow them to kind of see firsthand like why we do it and why they should care. So
So from what I'm hearing you say, it sounds like improving the infrastructure would like improve the health and like the, I don't know, water consumption of the water consumer, which is all of us, but like, would improving the infrastructure also benefit the environment, or would that be like neutral? I'm just interested to hear that.
Honestly, I've never thought about that, but I do feel like it would. I feel like if we can improve the way our water is being, like the places that our water is being treated and the way it's getting to us, I do feel like that would also positively impact like the environment. I mean, I can't speak off the top of my head exactly how it would do that, but I do feel like it would. I feel like those kinds of things are something that when they started the base of the root of the issue, I feel like that's, I don't know, I guess it's not trickled down, it'd be like the opposite, build up. But I feel like it has that kind of effect. So yeah, I definitely think it would help the environment. So yeah, good question. Hayden.
What made me think of this? Did you find anything about like, so obviously I'm from Colorado. I know like, until I came here, I'd never known what a boil order was.
Yeah.
So do you think that, or did you find the like numbers of like the amount of plants in Illinois versus like the amount of plants in Colorado? Like, are there, you probably don't know them off the top of your head, but like, yeah, is that do you think there's a difference? Because her thing talking about like nature and everything, there's a lot more
Like natural.
natural
Yeah,
stuff
yeah,
like in Colorado, because I've never had a problem with water in my life
Yeah,
until I came here. Now I have to have a faucet that has a filter on it because
right.
I think the water is not very good.
Yeah, so that is something that I really didn't look at too much in my research, but I think that that's really interesting to think about. Because I also think a lot of people don't realize, especially people in the Midwest, because like you said, like you didn't have to worry about boil orders in Colorado because your water probably comes from the mountains or like natural springs and stuff. And there's probably a very different like treatment process for that. So definitely very interesting. And I didn't think about that in my research, but that's super interesting to think about. And I think will be something that I probably do look into because I'm just intrigued. But yeah, I'm sure there is very different processes that goes for that and probably very different opinions on water for people that are from areas that don't have to get their water from the lake and treat it. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That's what ours is too.
Everything.
Oh, just one other thing.
Okay.
Liz, could you
Yeah.
have like Myrtle the turtle or something? So
Oh, like Smokey the Bear.
Could you have, like Myrtle the turtle?
That would be so cute.
The little kids like Bertle and.
Myrtle.
Family and turtles and things stuff like that. Would little child, do you want to kill turtles?
I mean, can we come up with like a cool name that goes with like, it's gonna sound weird, but like tapeworm, like there's tapeworms in your wastewater.
Oh.
Like at the plant, I get to see little tapeworms float around in the water. It's like obviously that water is treated and sent into the river, good, but
Tapeworm is the mortal enemy of Myrtle the turtle.
there you go.
Children. And this is a whole, I see a whole.
Yeah.
It's the new marble.
I don't know why we
I
don't know why we couldn't do something. I mean, yeah, it's literally we do Smokey the Bear and everyone loves Smokey the Bear.
Yeah,
So yeah.
so
no,
you,
sure.
okay, you can contract me out. I'll
Okay.
come with a bunch of.
Trademark, got it.
Great.
Amazing. All right, we're gonna stop there. Thank you so much. Montreal Thomas, who will be presenting a seminar presentation about public school funding. A few words about Monty. Monty is also an incredibly hardworking student and someone who probably could have done anything and majored in almost any program here on campus. You're just one of the few people that I've ever known who's had a major in or a minor in each of the 3 divisions. So it was thrilling to be like, we got him political science. But it's been like an incredible privilege to get to have a sidecar seat next to you while you have embarked on this journey of doing a seminar project, because they're not easy. And oftentimes we think it's going to be one way. We have a really big idea sometimes, and then when we get down to the nitty gritty of doing the thing, it can be very challenging. And so I'm, very proud of the way that you have overcome the obstacles. Very similar to Liz, like you had an idea in mind of how you thought it was going to be. And oftentimes when you're in the midst of the research, you realize, oh no, like it's not going to work out in the way that I thought. And that's part of the process of what you learn. How do you adapt and problem solve and when things need to change. So without further ado, I turn it over to Monty to tell us about his work looking at public school funding.
Yeah,
Whenever.
Alright. Thank you, Dr. Weedlocker. Like, she said, I'll be presenting to you guys today my senior seminar, and I decided to do public school funding and student achievement and the effects of funding on it. So why did I choose this topic? So before I start, I would like to ask everyone, who here went to a public school? Wow, that's crazy. Who here ever heard like their teachers complaining about like a lack of resources in the classroom? Whoever had out of date books, those kinds of things. I know for me, when I grew up in middle school, the facilities that we had weren't up to date. I frequently heard teachers complaining about our facilities and the fact that they weren't getting paid enough to do what they were doing. They were frequently having to come out of pocket to provide, I would say, an adequate education to our students. And it wasn't until I was in high school that, I guess fortunately and unfortunately at the same time, I was able to go to a predominantly white high school across town. And this was in a very like densely metropolitan area that was primarily European American. So a lot of the resources that I saw at that high school were starkly different than what I had at my middle school and our local high schools. So I was able to take advanced placement classes. There was international baccalaureate programs. There was programs where you could study abroad and do like all those different kinds of things that I wouldn't have been able to do unless I went to a different high school. So my research question. I wanted to see whether or not an increase in funding in school districts in the states of Maryland, Missouri, and New York would lead to an increase in graduation rates for those respective school districts. And I chose these school districts particularly because they all have different funding models, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So who's interested in this kind of research? So of course, we have like our nonprofit organizations. I'm pretty sure some of you guys have heard of the Move On group. They do a lot of things, especially when we hear about like school shootings. They're some of the first proponents like get behind legislators immediately to talk about things such as background checks, gun safety, things of that nature. They also do work for public education. And then the same thing for political action committees that are like linked to legislators. And of course, more money for public schools. A lot of students would probably be happy about that. Not having to use old materials anymore. Actually being able to do stuff. And then school boards. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard of like the banning of books in a lot of southern states. And I think just presenting this issue to them would kind of like shift the gear on things that don't necessarily matter or I think are important, you know, banning books about African Americans, books about women, books about those in the LGBTQ plus community. And focusing on actual issues like the education of our actual students and are they actually receiving one? Right. So here I have my conceptual framework. So up here at the top is my dependent variable, which is my graduation rates in the 3 states that I mentioned previously. And then I have my 3 independent variables. So my first one is race and ethnicity. So when I collected my data, a lot of it comes broken up by race and ethnicity. So our normal categories, European American, African American or Black, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Pacific Islander, etc. And then my second independent variable was majority minority districts. Now, what this is out of all of the school districts that I was able to get from these 3 states, I looked at them and I said, hey, which of them have a population of students that has less than 50% European American students in them? And I wanted to see whether or not those specific school districts had different graduation rates in comparison to those that didn't. And then my last one, state funding models. Again, I wanted to see that the way that these states were collecting their money and spending their money just led to different outcomes among the graduation rates of students. So my literature review. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you might be familiar with like the long-standing tradition of racism in this country. So one of the main things that popped up again and again and again as I was doing research in this topic was Brown v. Board of Education that happened in 1954. And as we are probably all familiar with, this is the case that established integration in both the public sector and within the school system. So if this wasn't decided in favor of integration, I probably wouldn't be in the same room with you guys today. So some of the, I guess, cases that led up to Brown v. Board were, I guess, like they were in it for like the long haul. So like there were cases like maybe a decade or decades before Brown v. Board was actually decided, just to like get some steam rolling before the actual like case was pushed for. So like an example was Briggs v. Elliott, where there was a predominantly Black school, of course, all Black school, excuse me, that was petitioning for actual like busing to get kids to and from the school, to and from the school. And then in another case, Bowling v. Sharp, a high school in Washington, D.C., a community petitioned their court because the high school in that district was not letting 11 African American students in, even though they had a bunch of empty classrooms in their school. And then following this, in 1966, was a government issued study. It was called the Coleman Report. And what they did was kind of like a nationwide diagnostic of student achievement across the country. So how were white students stacking up against African American students? And then what they found was, in their findings, they didn't say that funding was like a significant factor in student achievement, which I found kind of like, that doesn't seem right. And what they attributed student achievement to were one, teachers that were present in the classroom, and kind of what they said was like the culture that was present around those students. So, you know, kind of like a dog whistle to like, you know, Black families or minority families, of course, wouldn't be, what would be the word? Wouldn't have an aptitude for education because solely because they're Black. And then in a 2019 study written at all, they looked at court-mandated desegregation. So in the years between 1991 and 2009, there were still school districts that had to have government appointed integration programs. Like they couldn't do it on their own because of school choice. I don't know if we've all heard it before. It's just the idea that I get to send my kids wherever I want to. And of course, not of course, that kind of sounds bad, but white families didn't want their children around Black students. So what they found was after 2009, for those school districts that had court-mandated integration, they immediately segregated again. So this is just like another, I guess, factor pointing towards the issue that we have here. Then another one that another study that I looked at was 2017. And what they found was there was already like an established connection between socioeconomic status and race. But what they wanted to look at was for families that were in a higher like tax bracket or socioeconomic status, they wanted to see for those affluent school districts, what was like the racial makeup there. And what they found was for affluent school districts, it was predominantly white. Whereas for Black families with comparable incomes as these white families, they were only found in school districts with white families with significantly less income than these white families. And lastly, like I said earlier, I decided to choose these three states, Maryland, Missouri, and New York, because of their separate funding models. And what I found for Maryland, Missouri, well, actually all three of them, I'll start with that first, is they all assign a base amount to their students, and then they add multipliers on top of that. So for instance, this isn't the actual numbers, but there are 100 students at a school, and I'm going to say each kid needs about $5,000. And then depending on whether the student happens to have disabilities, whether you're in a career and technicals program at your school, or whether you're in advanced placement, they'll give you multipliers on top of that. So say if you happen to have a disability, they might add a 1.5 multiplier on top of that $5,000. So that would make that out that base amount from 5,000 jump up to $7,500. Also, Maryland and Missouri only have a floor on the amount of local dollars that they're able to collect from their for their school districts. So what that means is they just need to meet a certain threshold for how much they're able to give certain school districts. And after that, they can rally up as much money as they want. And certain school districts will obviously have a certain advantage over others. And in New York, unlike the other two, sets a ceiling on how much local dollars that they can collect. So there isn't, I guess, much room for a large like funding gap between schools. So for my data collection, so across all three states, I was able to collect demographic data. So again, race and ethnicity data, and that was for about 1,245 school districts. And I was also able to collect data on just the amount of funding that school districts on average were receiving and on the individual level. So here I have just some charts from my paper. So here we have some descriptive statistics from Maryland. So the average funding per student in the state is about $17,000. And the average amount that they receive from the government, but on the federal level is about 37 million, and they collect almost 6.5, or rather, what is that? $600 billion from just local taxes. And then here is like the racial makeup in this first column of what it looks to be in Maryland. So here we have it's primarily European American. The second highest population is African American at about 25%, then Hispanic, and less than 10% would be those identified as multiracial, Asian and Pacific Islander, or Native American. And then next to this, we have the graduation rates for each one of these racial categories. Here I have the same thing for Missouri. This one has a little bit less funding per student at about $16.8 thousand. Also, they have less federal aid, about $2 million. The state and local funding that they receive is about $24 million. Then here again, we have the racial makeup. This one is has a European American population that is significantly higher than Maryland at about 73%. The second highest population is Black or African American students, then Hispanic again, and then less for multiracial students and Asian and Pacific Islander students, along with Native American students. And again, here you can see the graduation rates for each racial category. And then lastly, for New York, this one was surprising. The average funding that they receive per student is $73,000. Now, this may not seem right at first, but when you think about it, you have to imagine that there is a very significant gap in the amount of funding that school districts receive. So this 73,000 isn't for every school district across the board. There could be school districts where students are receiving 100,000 on average per student, and some where they're receiving around maybe 10,000. So that's why we come up with just these very large numbers. And the average federal funding is about almost 2 million, and then state and local dollars that they collect is around 47 million. And then again, here we have the racial makeup. This, like Missouri, is predominantly white. And then the second highest racial category is Hispanic students, and then Black and African American students. And here are the graduation rates for New York, which I believe were significantly lower than the other two states. Right, and here are some of my graphs that I have. So each one of these dots that you see represents an individual school district for the states of Maryland, Missouri, New York, and they're labeled that way. So the blue circles that you see are for Maryland, the green triangles that you see are for Missouri, and the red squares are for New York. So what I found was, as funding increased across the x-axis, graduation rates also increase, specifically for Black and African American students in the states of Missouri and New York. However, in Maryland, it was the opposite, which I found weird. And so that means there needs to be a little bit more work done there, but there also wasn't enough information to go off with, because Maryland, unlike the other two states, only has 20 school districts, whereas Missouri and New York have over 500. Next, we have the Hispanic students, and it's the exact same trend. As funding increases in the states of Missouri and New York, there is a positive trend in graduation rates. And then same thing here for European American students. We have positive trends again. As funding increases, graduation rates increase. So what were some of my main findings? So what I found was funding is a factor, but with all the variation that I saw in my graphs, like for instance, there is this positive trend, but look at all of these like districts down here that have graduation rates less than 60%. Some even less, where is that one that I saw? One is less than 10%, which is a travesty. So there's other stuff going on, and because of like what I found in like my math statistics stuff that you can read in my paper. And there are likely other factors to explain why there's so much variation going on. I just simply wasn't able to collect that data from my study. And what are some of my limitations and my conclusions? So of course, some of my limitations were the amount of states that I was able to collect data for. So I only have 3 states and I only looked at the way funding impacts those. There could be a state whose funding model provides the best outcomes in terms of graduation rates for students. Secondly, we have student achievement. I only use graduation rates as a factor to assess that. There can be plenty of other things like, oh, are students pursuing a higher education after high school? Are we considering SAT and ACT scores? Or I don't know about you guys, but we had like some like semester testing that we had to do in high school. I'm not sure if that was a across Illinois thing, but things like that can also be used to determine student achievement. And then all the data that I collected was only in the school year of 2019. So there could be other stuff going on, and this could just be like a one-off for them. I know this was like pre-pandemic, so maybe there was something going on in these individual states that it would explain why, especially for New York, why the graduation rates were so low. All right, you guys have any questions for me? Shelley.
I do too. I guess they always come in twos. I don't know if you know this, and it's fine if you don't, I don't. So I was surprised at the differences in federal funding, given what I know about the wealth of the states. So I'm wondering, like, what is federal funding even based on? Like, how do they decide who gets what? And if you don't know that, that's fine, but it just seems weird to me. Like, didn't you tell me that Maryland was among the wealthier states?
Mm-hmm.
And so that they're getting more federal funding than like Missouri. How come?
I think you're right. That's something I would have to look into.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. People know? No, okay. It's interesting to me. I have no idea. The other thing is, and you may not know this either, do you think that New York City skews the data for New York State?
Now that I think about it, yes, because it is a larger area than the rest of the state, so most likely, yes.
And there's just such a disparity of have and have nots in New York City, you know, too. And so, yeah, I just wonder what effect that has on that state.
And I only like included like some statistics for my presentation because I didn't want to throw a bunch of numbers at you guys. But this was just the average. So there, of course, were some school districts that had over a 90% on graduation rate. So yes,
That is pretty shocking.
New York
isn't
could
it?
have been skewed.
Thank you.
Mhm. Dr. Lee Walker.
Okay, so I've enjoyed like learning sort of alongside you as you have done this. I'm curious what you think about like the multipliers. Do you think that's a good approach to kind of caveating funding?
I don't think so because it assumes that everyone with a particular, like, for instance, like I said before, disability has like the same financial need, which of course there are a bunch of different disabilities that a child may have. And in terms of finances, that can look different on an individual basis. I think that they should try like setting aside an amount for each state, just a lump sum of money for that specific thing, giving out the base amount per usual, and just seeing like a test run. Year one, how much on average do they take for students that happen to have disabilities? How much should they take for students with higher education needs? How much should they take for students that with career and technical, and just letting them take out? And then looking at averages and then seeing like what would be the best amount to allocate for year one, year two, year three going forward.
Yeah.
That would seem something more sensible. Dr. Neal?
Okay, so one of the very interesting things that you find here is that you have two states where the story is very positive, kind of like you would expect, more money, more resources, you can hire more staff, you can do more things, so you end up with a positive outcome for your students. And then Maryland's going the other way. Do you think that might be, is that driven based, this is, you're the most knowledgeable person in the room about this. Do you think that is something based off of how Maryland is doing their funding? Or do you think there's something else going on in the state, some other part of the story?
I think it has to be something else that's going on, because for them to be receiving so much money and not having like I guess you would say like the Carfax in terms of graduation rates to show for how much money they're spending on students, something else has to be going on.
You want to speculate what it might be?
Ooh. Because isn't Maryland more like rural than anything else?
There's Baltimore, which is
Yeah, and then you've got all the suburbs around DC.
DC. So, there is a lot of urbanism there.
And I would imagine some disparity,
Me too.
like you've got some extreme,
Extremely wealthy enclaves.
Yeah.
In some parts of Baltimore, you
My
just talk your heart
husband
out.
is in Maryland, and it's a very rural area, but also very wealthy.
Yeah.
So it's kind of confusing.
yeah,
Children in Melbourne, I think, but.
yeah. It's interesting, it's just, I don't know, it's interesting.
I think you're right, though. I do think it's something else.
Any other questions?
I kind of have like a pull off of Shelley's question about New York City. Don't each of these states have an urban area that would skew each data set in some way? And if so, does that affect the overall data collection in comparison, or does that just level out when taking into consideration the New York data skew?
I think it would skew all of them, because I know some school districts have a much larger population than others. I know from just looking at my data, there were some school districts that only accounted for maybe 70 odd students, where there were some with just hundreds.
Yeah.
So, and this is like the average per student, so there definitely could be like, I wouldn't know how to like approach that differently, and just looking at it per student.
You would have to literally look at every single district, and compare, it'd be years of
We'd have to
research.
match.
That's something for a computer to do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, you'd want to be able to do some math thing, maybe when you're in grad school.
Put that in the estimates.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're good.
Thank you.
No, we'll take the button yet, but it's almost done.
Great job.
Okay, I do want to go in the middle of this part.
How long did I go?
That was 27 minutes.
Oh, God.
You did so well.
Was I good on time as well?